Good morning, you guys. It's your boy Bill Mahari here, representing Mahari Nation Sports Podcast. Much love to the entire LDBC and the basketball community. You understand what I'm saying? If you guys want to tune in for some more basketball content, tune in to Basketball Conversations every Friday night, 9 p.m. Central Time. This is where we discuss basketball-related topics, news, debates, and everything else in the world of basketball. If you're new to the channel, make sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the bell icon to get all the latest notifications when I start dropping videos and live streams. So this version of historical perspective this morning is a little different because we're going to be touching upon some baseball here. So I was requested by one of our top subscribers to do a video about a particular World Series. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the 1996 World Series. This was the matchup between the defending champion Atlanta Braves versus the New York Yankees. So some background on this. Okay, the Atlanta Braves were pretty much at that point the so-called team in the 90s. All right, they have already made three World Series in their first 5 years, and they made the first ever World Series in a long time back in 1991, and ended up losing in a tough seven-game series against my Minnesota Twins that featured the clutch home run by Kirby Puckett in Game 6, the walk-off, and then the unforgettable performance by Jack Morris by pitching 10 strong innings of shutout baseball and gave the Twins a chance before Gene Larkin hit the game-winning RBI single to score in forgot his name, but anyway, they went on to win the 91 World Series in a tough seven-game struggle. Then by 1992, the Atlanta Braves returned back into the World Series after surviving a dramatic seven-game series against the Pittsburgh Pirates that featured the Orlando basically the Orlando the Strubel Cabrera RBI that basically scored in Sid Bream from second base, and then basically Barry Bonds threw the ball that nearly missed him at home plate, but ended up losing in 6 games at the hands of the Toronto Blue Jays. So then by '93, the Atlanta Braves were catching up with the San Francisco Giants in the then NL West, and they came back down like at least 10 games into the month of September, and came back and won the division in a playoff against the Giants. But by that time, they were out of energy, and then they ended up losing in 6 games at the hands of the Philadelphia Phillies. Then by '94, there was no baseball due to the strike. By '95, the Braves knew that this was championship or bust that year, and led by their top pitching rotation, which is led by three future Hall of Famers: Craig Maddox, John Smoltz, and Tom Glavine. All right, each of them guys had already taken turns winning Cy Young awards, and so they ended up winning the series in 6 games at the hand against the Cleveland Indians, who was the leaders of home runs and runs batted in during that year. And heading into '96, there was expectations that they were going to repeat as champions. On the other side of the ledger, the New York Yankees finally returned back to the fall slash for the first time since 1981. Now, the previous year, they ended up losing in a tough 5 game series against the Seattle Mariners. It was one of the most dramatic series, pretty much of the last few years. And so by that time, that team was constructed basically of young, hungry players and proven veterans that were dire to win their first championship. Okay, so when you look back at that time here, guys, okay, these were two teams one that was looking to make history, winning back to back, and one that was looking to start a new dynasty during the '90s. Okay, so the, the the Yankees at that time they were basically compiled of Paul O'Neill, a young Bernie Williams, Jorge Posada, Joe Girardi, Cecil Fielder, who came in from a trade midway through the season, um, the former Mets stars of Darryl Strawberry and Dwight Gooden. You also had David Cohn, Andy Pettit, who was his second year in the league. You also had a young Mariano Rivera. You also had John Wetland, who ended up being the World Series MVP that year. You also had Derek Jeter, who was in his rookie year. You know what I mean? And then you also had Joe Torre, who was in his first year as the manager, who has yet to make a World Series appearance against the heavily favored Atlanta Braves. So ending into this series, guys, this was going to be a very much it was going to be pretty much a series. It's going to be a tough series to the finish. So heading into Game One, guys, the Yankees finished up their series against the Baltimore Orioles in 5 games, but the Braves trailed 3 games to 1 against the St. Louis Cardinals, and ended up coming back to win the series in 7 by outscoring the St. Louis Cardinals 32-1 in the last 3 games, come back and to win that series. And so very much their offense was pretty much on fire. You had that's of the Atlanta side with Tom, with basically with Marquise Grissom. You had Mark Lemke. You had uh, Fred McGriff. You had Chipper Jones, Andrew Jones, Javi Lopez, who was the NLCS MVP that series. You also had uh, what's his name? What's his name? Ryan Klesko too. Yep. And then you had the bench. You had Mark Blauser. You had Terry Pendleton. You had Jeff Blauser too. I mean, this was a very heavily squatted team against against the Yankees. So starting from game one, all right. Starting from game one, the Braves continued their hot offense, and they struck first basically top of the second inning when rookie Andrew Jones, who was only 19 at the time, with catcher Javier Lopez uh, on second base with 2 out. He ended up hitting a 2-run homer over the left field fence to start off the score. 2-0 Atlanta. Then in the next inning, the defending champions broke the game open. Jeff Blauser and Marquise Grissom opened the top of the inning with some singles. All right. Then they moved into scoring position after the sacrifice run from Mark Lemke. Then Chipper Jones singled to score the runners, advancing to second on a throw to the plate. Then Fred McGriff batted, and then basically Jones went out of nowhere, stole third base without notice to basically put us up in scoring position when Fred McGriff singled to score himself back, basically to score another run. Then after issuing a walk to Lopez, unfortunately, Joe Torre had no choice but to pull Andy Pettit out of the game and basically called Brian Bowringer to basically get him out of the gym, which eventually they did. Not before they scored the remaining runs. So basically, it was 8-0 Atlanta after basically 3 innings. Then it continued on. Bo Ringer went up against a young Jermaine Dye, who was a rookie that year, and got him to fly out to left until Andrew Jones did it again by hitting his second home run to make the score 8-0. All right. So Andrew Jones basically became the second player in World Series history to win to score 2 home runs in his first 2 World Series at bats, and the Yankees couldn't do anything about it against John Smoltz. So basically, John Smoltz basically pitched some brilliant baseball and only gave up basically that 1 run throughout that whole game, and the Braves blew the Yankees out 12-1 to take home game one. Then game two basically was basically another key start between veteran Yankee pitcher Jimmy Key against 4-time Cy Young Award winner Greg Maddux. And basically it was all for basically it was a much needed game for the Yankees at that point. And then unfortunately, the Yankees, as happening in game one, they struggled against the Braves starter. Maddox pitched 8 innings of shutout baseball, despite only giving up 6 hits and only allowing 2 runners to reach the third base the entire time he was basically on the mound. And only despite the fact that he struck out 2 batters, he basically managed to retire most other hitters that he faced on groundouts and did not issue a single walk. All right. Meanwhile, the 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 Yankees had troubles getting Fred McGriff out. Had trouble getting Fred McGriff out with runners on base. And then in the first inning, following a pitch Keith thought it was a strike, McGriff singled on a 2-out with 2 outs to basically drive home Mark Lemke, who had a ground rule double earlier. Then in the third inning, McGriff again came up to the plate with Marquise Grissom at third base and singled again to score another one. So it was 2-0. And then basically after that, uh, and finally in the fifth, McGriff scored in the third run of the game by hitting a sacrifice to score Lemke from third with nobody out. Then in the fourth run came in when Grissom singled off the key in the sixth inning to drive it home Terry Pendleton. So, and pretty much it was a wrap pretty much from here on in because Mark Willis, who was the reliever at that time, basically relieved Maddox and and finished off the Yankees in the ninth, striking out Bernie Williams, Tino Martinez, and Paul O'Neill to basically end the game. 2-0 Atlanta. And when you were basically down 2 games to nothing, and when you lose the first 2 games on your home field, you were pretty much asking to be swept. And after the game, Joe Steinbrenner basically called up Joe Torre to basically come down to his office and pretty much was furious at how they performed. But that was before Joe Torre pretty much told them that he guaranteed they were going to win 3 straight in Atlanta to bring the series back to Yankee Stadium to clinch it. And Steinbrenner doubted that, and he said, and quote, "If you guys can't beat the Braves at home, you surely can't beat them down in Atlanta." So we switched the series to Atlanta, shall we? And that time, Joe Torre made some key decisions that really shook up the lineup there, guys. So he decided to take out Paul O'Neill, Wade Boggs, and Tino Martinez, who were struggling up to that point, and then basically put in Charlie Hayes, replacing Boggs at third base, putting Darryl Strawberry at right field, and then basically the Tories decided to keep the slugger Cecil Fielder in the lineup at first base. So with the series down 3 games to nothing, the Yankees turned to their top ace, David Cone. All right. Now, some historical context about David Cone throughout the year. David Cone last year, the previous year in '95, signed a 3-year contract to stay with the Yankees. After basically he was traded by Toronto during that year. Now, at the start of the '96 year, um, David Cone pitched very well, but then unfortunately doctors discovered an aneurysm in his pitching arm and was most forced to miss the rest of this year. But it wasn't until August when he came back against a game against Oakland when he pitched 7 shutout innings of baseball in a victory in Oakland. But people were very skeptical of how David Cone was going to perform because remember, he had not pitched almost the entire year, and the tendency is that for most pitchers they're worried about their control and then the rhythm of their pitches because if you don't pitch for a long period of time, you tend to lose the little grip and the zip on your pitches. So that was all on the line there. Then the Braves countered by basically starting up last year's World Series MVP, Tom Glavine, who the previous year basically shut out the entire Indians offense for 8 strong innings and basically helped them lead them to the championship in a 1-0 classic. So heading into that game, it was a must win for the Yankees. So when the Yankees started out here in Atlanta, they got on the board immediately when Tim Raines led off the game with a walk, and then was moved by a sacrifice bunt by Derek Jeter, who and also by the way was dealing with a bruised wrist after getting hit by a pitch by Greg Maddux in Game 2. So then Bernie Williams, who was basically struggling, who was 0 for 9 in the first 2 games, basically drove in Tim Raines with a single, and then the Yankees added another run in the 4th inning. All right. After Williams reached on a Jeff Blauser error, he would advance on a walk by Fielder, then a line drive that Andrew Jones caught. But then Gerald Strawberry drove in the unearned run with a single. And then after Mariano Duncan struck out, Joe Girardi drew a walk to put the 2 runners on for Cone. Then Cone managed to make contact, but the ball hit basically at a stumbling Chipper Jones, who touched on third base to end the inning. But either way, the Yankees were up 2-1. All right. Then David Cone was doing his job, basically shutting it down, basically keeping the Brave batters at check. All right. Then in the 6th, he was getting some trouble when he walked Tom Glavine. Then he followed up by basically giving up a single to Marquise Grissom, their top leadoff hitter. Then after retiring Mark Lemke on a failed bunt attempt, Cones load the bases by walking up Chipper Jones. Then Fred McGriff popped off to Jeter for the second out before Ryan Kruskel drew the walk to force John Glavine into home, cutting the lead to 2-1. But eventually, Cone got Javi Lopez to pop out and to Joe Girardi to basically close out the inning. That would be all she wrote for the Rays scoring at that point. Glavine would be finished up in the 7th, only giving up 4 hits and the unearned run in the 1st inning and the unearned run in the 4th. Then the Yankees broke the game open in the 8th when basically Jeter reached on a single from reliever Greg McMichael. And then after that, Bernie Williams extended the lead with a 2-run homer to put them up 4-1. All right. And that was all they needed because then after that, Mariano Rivera, who was basically the setup man before he became the closer years later, basically retired the Braves in order before John Wetland basically closed out the entire game in the bottom of the 9th to basically cut the lead to 2-1. So 2-1 Braves. Now heading into the most important game, Game 4. This is the game that shifted the entire complexion of the series. All right. So because of the fact that there was a rain delay before the series began, this forced both teams to basically shift the rotations. So Denny Nagel of the Braves, who basically saw some action in Game One of that series, was their starter from Atlanta. All right. Then Kenny Rogers made his start for the Yankees. Now, a little bit of context on Kenny Rogers. He was signed by the Texas Rangers during the offseason where he made his first All-Star team. But he was struggling the second half of the year when he pitched poorly during the postseason, and then was pulled early during his starts in the division series and the ALCS. Unfortunately, the struggles continue because in the bottom of the second inning, he basically gave up a leadoff home run to Fred McGriff to start off the scoring. Then after Javi Lopez and Andrew Jones walked, Jermaine Dye sacrificed Lopez to third. Then followed by a Jeff Blauser bunt single to score Lopez, and then after that, Nagel bunt to Vance Jones and Blauser. After that, Marquise Grissom double off of Rogers to give the Atlanta a 4-0 lead. This forced the Yankees to pull Rogers out of the ball game. All right, and then after that, the Yankees bullpen did their job. They actually did. The big difference was, and I'm going to get to this in a little bit. You got to give credit to the Yankees bullpen here. Now, despite the fact they gave up 2 runs, all right, 2 more runs to extend the lead to 6-0, nothing after the top of after the bottom of the fifth. You got to give the Yankees bullpen credit. They did a good job of basically reducing the damage and keeping the score in check before the Yankees offense got going. Then on the other side of the ball, Nagel was pitching shutout baseball and got the Yankees through 2 hits through his 5 innings. However, this is where things got in trouble for the Braves. All right, Derek Jeter led off the inning on a pop-up from near first base, and that as Fred McGriff and Mark Lingley chased the ball from the infield, right fielder Jermaine Dye was actually coming in to try to get the ball, and it was beautiful. It was basically a playable ball for him until the umpire, unfortunately, Tim Welke had his back turned to Dye and inadvertently blocked his vision from getting the ball, and the ball basically dropped right in front of him. Who knows? Who knows what the catch would have been? We don't know that, but I think that you can pretty much say that was kind of the break that the Yankees needed. Because then after that, Jeter basically singled to start off a 3-run rally, capped off by that same error. Then Cecil Fields singled that allowed the 2 runs to score to come in. Then after Charlie Hayes, he drove in fielder, and then Nagels was pulled in for Terrell Wade, who then after that, the Braves bullpen, walked Strawberry, and then was basically pulled in. Then Mike Bilecki, who was basically their one of their bullpen players for the Braves, struck out the next 3 batters to keep the score deadlocked to 6-3. So this is where the top of the eighth proved to be a huge disaster for the Braves. So Bobby Cox made the decision to bring in Mark Wohlers to try to go for a 2-inning save, knowing the fact that Mark Wohlers had not pitched more than 2 innings all season long. All right, and so he was putting Mark Wohlers, their top closer, in a position that he's never been familiar in. Okay, then this is where things really went out of hand, because then to start off the eighth, Charlie Hayes led off the inning with a dribbler down the left field, down the third base line, which the Braves were hoping that it was going to roll foul, but it did. Then Gerald Strawberry followed that up with a line drive single to Vance Hayes to second base. Then after that, Mariano Duncan hit a ground ball to Rafael Belliard, that looked like to be a double play. Unfortunately, Rafael Belliard didn't field the ball cleanly and it was only to get Strawberry out from second base. Then the great at bat that took place then. With 1 out and with runners at the corners from first and third, the Yankees put in Jim Lawrence, who basically went into the game as a defensive replacement for Joe Girardi into the plate. So, little context on Jim Lawrence. This was the kind of catcher that was basically bouncing around the league for a while, okay? But he was known for clutch hitting. The previous year in Game 2 against the Seattle Mariners in the bottom of the 15th inning, he hit a walk-off home run that drilled the right field fence to basically win the game for the Yankees and give them a 2-0 lead against Seattle, only to see them lose the series in 3 straight. So, heading into that huge at bat, Laird basically talked about that he felt that he had an advantage because Wallace was such a hard thrower that he was basically a soft fastball hitter, and he was basically looking for a fastball to basically hit with the basically hit to try to get it up the middle, to try to get it up the middle. But for some reason, Mark Wallace decided to throw slider, and only threw two fastballs during that whole at bat. And then with the count at 2-2, Laird uh, Mark Wohlers threw a slider that basically ran at the middle of the plate. Therefore, Jim Laird's had the opportunity to extend and basically pull the ball to left field and basically went over the left field wall as Andrew Jones was hoping to try to rob the ball against the wall. Tied the score at 6-6. Boy, did that home run lit the air out of the entire building. All right. It was the biggest home run of the entire series and pretty much destroyed the morale of the Braves. All right. Then we're going to skip back towards the top of the 10th. All right. So Steve Adry comes on the pitch, another veteran Braves player who basically was an integral part of their starting rotation for several years. But he was basically tasked to keep the score tied against the bottom of the Yankees line that just started out by retiring both Jim Leyritz and Graham Lloyd. Then things got in trouble. Avery had to face against the top of the lineup with walking Tim Raines. Then Derek Jeter followed up with a single. Then with two runners on base, Cox decided to basically walk Bernie Williams and then basically face up the fourth man on the spot. That was a copyright by Cecil Fielder. Then Torrey pulled that off by basically putting a pinch runner, Andy Fox, during the seventh. So basically, Cox intentionally loaded the bases. Okay, so Torrey responds back by setting up Wade Boggs to try to go in to drive in a go-ahead run. Now, people remember, Wade Boggs has an excellent, hitter's eye, which means that he can willingly be taking pitches even with two strikes. So the at bat, Avery had to count to 0-2 before he proceeded to basically lose four straight pitches outside of the plate to walk in the go-ahead run to give the Yankees the 7-6 lead. Then and then after that, Cox made a double switch by bringing in Brad Clumps to pitch hit, and then brought in Ryan Klesko to replace Fred McGriff at first base. Then after that, Charles Hayes hit a pop-up that Klesko had in sight, but then lost it in the lights, which allowed Derek Jeter to score and then close out the scoring with an 8-6 lead. Then after that, John Wetland pretty much closed out the final two at batters and then basically tied up the score and tied up the series at 2 games apiece. This was the second biggest comeback in World Series history since 1929. Unbelievable comeback. And when you look back at that game, it was a huge turning point of that entire series. Then after that, game five. Game five, Andy Pettitte redeemed himself by basically shutting down the entire Atlanta lineup. All right, and the only scoring that in that game is when basically, and it was basically off of a pop up that Cecil Fielder switched into right to score in the only run of the game in the top of the fourth. Pretty much after that, the Braves batters pretty much shut out. They left too many men on base, and the Yankees won 1-0 and brought the series back to New York up 3-2, looking to close out the series, just as Joe Torre guaranteed that he would do. And then we head into Game 6. Pretty much, it was basically championship of bust for the Yankees at that point. For the Braves, get to Game 7. So, heading into Game 6, the Yankees struck Maddox, who was their starter at that point, at the bottom of the third inning. Paul O'Neill led the frame by doubling off by Banksy and then advancing the third on a ground out by Mariano Duncan. Then Joe Girardi, the catcher, hit a fly ball to center field that Marquise Grissom misjudged it, which scored O'Neill and gave Girardi a triple. Then scored later on by Derek Jeter single, and then after Jeter's stole second base, Derek Jeter scored on a single by Bernie Williams. And those were the 3 runs that Maddox gave out the whole series. But they were costly as he basically worked only 4 2/3 inning without giving up another run. And then the Braves pretty much got back into the game in the top of the fourth as McGriff reached on the walk. Then Javier Lopez and Andrew Jones followed up with back-to-back singles to load up the bases. And then Jermaine Jai drew in a walk to force in the run. Then Jimmy Key got out of the bases loaded jam by getting designated hitter Terry Pendleton to ground into the double play. Then after that, we fast forward to the bottom, basically the top of the ninth. So Joe Torre pulled Key out of the game. With basically John Wetland was basically called upon for the fourth game of the series, but the Rays tried to rally after he struck out Andrew Jones to lead off the inning. Klesko and Pendleton got back-to-back singles off of Wetland. With one out and with the runners set to corners, Luis Polonia came off the bench to pinch hit for Jeff Blauser, but failed to produce a run and struck out swinging. Then Grissom followed that with another single, scoring Klesko, giving the Rays at least one more chance with Lemke at the plate. However, Lemke popped up to Charlie Hayes in foul territory, ending the game and ending the series. And then the Yankees celebrated with their first World Championship since 1978. But a little side note there, though, too. During some controversy in the fifth, Mark Lemke was at the plate with one out. Girardi dropped the pitch from Key, and then Grissom tried to advance on Girardi's floor, and the throw was late, and Pearson was safe. But Terry Tata, who was basically umpiring second base, called Grissom out, which prompted Bobby Cox to emerge out of the dugout and begin to argue with no avail, and Bensley got himself ejected. Just thought I'd let you guys know about it. But anyway, this was an unforgettable series from start to finish. And when you look back on that series, it was the one series that the Braves had it in the bag, but they blew every single opportunity. They let runners on base, left runners on base. The bullpen destructed. All right, they didn't get the key outs that they needed, and as a result, the Yankees were able to get back into those three games in Atlanta. You know what I mean? They had clutch hitting. Their bullpen did the job, and then the starting pitching turned it around when they needed. This is why the Braves, as great as they were in the 90s, they didn't invest enough in their bullpen, and it showed in their losses. And by the time they faced each other again in 1999, the Yankees were at their complete form. There was no stopping the Yankees at that point. Here's a little historical part for you guys. The two losses in 96 were the only losses the Yankees endured during that whole stretch in the 90s. 98, they swept the Padres. And then in 99, they swept the same Braves. So basically, they went 14-2 during that whole. I should say they went 12-2 during that whole stretch of 96, 98, and 99. Just amazing. And you can look back on that series of how this all began, because the Braves were expected to be the team in the 90s and basically become a dynasty. But the Yankees put an end to that and pretty much became the dynasty in the 90s. And they went on to win 114 games in 98, and they become the greatest dynasty of the 90s. And you can look back on that series of how this all began. So I just want to give you guys a little historical perspective on that. And man, this was my longest one yet. But let me know what you guys think in the comments section.